Welcome to Mamahood After Trauma. I'm Emily, your host. Here we share strategies and inspiration to help you heal and grow with kindness and understanding. Let's dive in. This is Mamahood After Trauma. Hey there, Mama. Before we dive in, I want to remind you to grab your Unlocking Peace Guide, a free resource designed to help you start creating calm, reclaim your peace, and manage your triggers with ease. Head over to my website, the link is in the show notes, to download it now. Hello, Mama, and welcome to this episode of the Mamahood After Trauma podcast. I am so excited that you have taken some time out of your busy mama schedule to tune in and listen. Today, we are blessed to have Melissa Schwartz with us. She's passionate about talking to highly sensitive persons. Are you aware of what a highly sensitive person is? Did you know, fun factoid that I just learned, as trauma survivors, we are more likely to have traits associated with being a highly sensitive person. And so I'm excited to have this conversation with Melissa. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here, Emily.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So, how did you get started in this work?
My favorite question. I always say I was born into it. I am the younger of two siblings. Both my parents were educators. And so when my older brother was young, they were in a lot of ego because everything they did worked for them. And then when I was born 4 years later, nothing that they did worked for me. And so they were kind of convinced that something with me had to be wrong because they both were highly educated and successful in their careers, and they'd started raising a child who where everything worked. And so fortunately, both of my parents were willing to learn more. I was born in 1980. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have Aaron's work that now we get to turn to learn more about high sensitivity. But eventually they did realize that there was just something innately different about who I was. And fast forward about 25 years, my brother and I had both moved to California after graduating from college and law school, respectively. And my parents moved out here, and my mom started doing workshops for parents. And I was going with her and selling her CDs in the back of the room. That's how long ago it was that we're still selling CDs. And she would talk about raising my brother and raising me. And naturally, everybody that comes to a workshop has kids like me. And people started coming up to me at the end and said, "Are you the daughter? Can I talk to you? You sound just like my kid." And so parents started asking me for coaching, essentially, to understand what was going on in their kids. And at that time, I didn't even have the language to recognize that I was highly sensitive. I didn't know about the research. I could just speak from my own experience of being more intense, more emotional, more empathetic, being an empath, being able to feel other people's emotions. And so I've been doing this work now for almost 15 years and working with families all over the world, teaching about high sensitivity and helping people turn on the light bulbs for themselves that there's nothing wrong with them, because high sensitivity is actually in about 20% of the population. It's a genetic trait. It's something that we are born with. It is not a diagnostic. There is no treatment. There's no medication. There's no protocol. It really just requires kind of a nuanced understanding of who these sensitive beings are so that we can grow up feeling empowered and good about ourselves and move out into the world to do our work, because sensitive people actually are here to change the world, to see the vision for how things can be better for all of us. So we've got important work to do. So I always like to say I'm helping parents raise a generation that won't need therapy, that won't need to recover from their childhood, because when we grow up feeling understood, we can usually just kind of coast and thrive. It's when we have a bumpy start that things can get a little bit rocky for us.
Yeah. So let's help our listeners understand first what a highly sensitive person is, because they may have these traits as a trauma survivor and
Yes.
not know that they're a highly sensitive person. They may just think that they're broken, and that's not true.
Totally. So I always like to reference back to Elaine Aron's research, who I already mentioned. She's sort of like the grandmother of the movement of high sensitivity, although Carl Jung really talked about highly sensitive in his work back in the early 1900s, I think. But Elaine Aron's like the modern founder of it. And her research talks about 4 common traits that are found in all highly sensitive people. And she uses an acronym of DOES. So I'm going to walk you through the DOES really quickly. So the D stands for depth of processing, meaning that as sensitive people, we are naturally deep processors, whether it's a conversation that we have or a movie that we see or a book that we read. We tend to really peel back all of the layers of an experience and look at it. And
Mhm.
so, as you can imagine, if you're the survivor of trauma, you can get really stuck kind of ruminating and
Mhm.
brooding
Mhm.
and feeling victimized, and it shouldn't have happened this way and it wasn't fair. And as sensitive people, because we have a proclivity to be deep processors, I would say there's kind of 2 ways to process. One is this like a merry-go-round or a hamster wheel where we just get
Mhm.
stuck and it's not good for us. The
No.
other is processing from a starting place to a place where we end up feeling better. And things like EMDR are really, really, really beneficial processing modalities for highly sensitive people who've had trauma. I've actually done a lot of EMDR myself personally, and it's been super healing and very validating and really helped me move out of this spiraling into kind of a more linear kind of a processing where we can land with a clarity and a new understanding and a new perspective that feels much more empowering. So that's the D. The O stands for overstimulation or over arousal. As
Mhm.
sensitive people, we have a tendency to reach over arousal or overstimulation more easily than non highly sensitive people. I once had a colleague explain it in a way that I thought was brilliant. She said, if people are like a bathtub and we fill
Mhm.
up, and somebody who's not highly sensitive, they fill up and they drain and they fill up and they drain. But
Mhm.
somebody who's highly sensitive, and this is also true for neurodivergent people,
Yep.
we fill up quickly, but we drain very slowly.
Mhm.
And so we can, if we continue taking it in, we will overflow. So we overflow more easily than non highly sensitive and neurotypical people do. Um, the third part of this is the E. The E stands for, I like to think about it as emotional saturation or emotional intensity, meaning that if we think about emotions like colors, for example, I like to think about a box of crayons. Think about
Mhm.
like the last back to school, and you can buy the primary pack or you can buy the value pack. Or if you're really lucky kid, you get a mom who will buy you that like wooden box with all of the paint and the markers and the glitter and the sparkles. That's the highly sensitive person. We've got, not only do we have more a broader range of emotions, but they're more nuanced and they're more intense. So while a non highly sensitive person might experience like red, yellow, green as happy, sad, nervous, we experience cobalt and magenta and
Mhm.
fuchsia as exhilarated and heartbroken, and these more complex emotions. And so in childhood, it can also be really confusing because we're feeling these bigger things, but we don't have the vocabulary or the language or even the ability to really identify and then express them. And so a lot of sensitive children feel a lot of frustration or kind of like um, this like internal turmoil because they can't really articulate what they're experiencing, even though for them it feels real. Just like if you took a 5-year-old to an art museum, they're experiencing all of these colors. They just might not be able to label teal versus turquoise versus sky blue, right? And then the fourth pillar is the S, which stands for sensing subtleties, which means that as sensitive people, we're just more tuned in. We notice details that others might not notice. This could translate into sensory experiences. This can translate into energetic experiences. into body language on other people. And if we have experienced any trauma, this can really look like hypervigilance, because now we are really looking out and tuned in to where is the next threat showing up. So, and there's one more thing that I want to say about high sensitivity that you didn't ask me about, but because this is what we're talking about, it feels really important. Highly sensitive people have a bigger proclivity to experiencing trauma because we experience things on a deeper level, because we are sensing subtleties, because we experience things so intensely and emotionally. Like, for example, my older brother and I shared a lot of experiences growing up,
Mm-hmm.
but the way that it impacted us was completely different. There were things that
Absolutely.
were absolutely traumatic for me that for him, he just kind of brushed them off. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say that highly sensitive people are more likely to experience trauma, but if we aren't given the nurturing and the guidance and the support to process things, it can feel like trauma for us because we're left to process ourselves, and then we can sort of get stuck back on this loop and
Mm-hmm.
kind of keep ourselves in the upset, or leave ourselves with this emotion that is unprocessed in a healthy way.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, wow. So, as a highly sensitive person, um, who has trauma, okay, and now they're in parenthood,
Yes.
that's a whole suitcase full of stuff.
Yeah, it is.
So, what can you say to what tips or resources can you give our listener who is in that dealing with that suitcase to help them feel validated and empowered?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to say the first piece is to acknowledge that that's what's going on,
Hmm.
and not to internalize it as I'm a bad mom,
Hmm.
or guilt or shame or embarrassment or self-judgment or hiding because you don't want people to know. um, we can all be really good at that as parents, right? Feeling that way, trauma or not. So I want to just
Yeah.
start with that as a baseline, that um, my approach to working with families is judgment, shame, and guilt free.
Mhm.
Because if anybody feels bad about what's legitimately going on for them, it's going to make it so much harder to shift out of
Yeah.
it. And so the goal is first just to make peace with
Mhm.
what's going on and acknowledge it, and sort of self validate it. Like, this
Yeah.
is really hard, and this
Yeah.
is triggering X, Y, or Z thing for me.
Yeah.
And starting there can be really helpful. I also want to say that for me, I have an 11-year-old stepdaughter. Very often, I will notice some trauma resurface based on her age and what's going on for her. And so I don't know if this is something that you found in your work
Absolutely.
in this field,
Me
but
personally,
um,
yeah.
yeah, I've actually really noticed that as she gets older, it takes me back to things that happened for me at that age. Like, recently, we were talking about school and friends and the Mean Girls, which is so different now than it was when I was growing up. Right? We
Yeah.
didn't have cell phones and social media, but in talking with her, I could feel myself going back
Mhm.
to some of the trauma of that, of middle school, and really having to have some awareness for myself and say, like, this, what's happening to her is not what happened to me, and what's
Mhm.
happening to her is not happening to me again. And so again, it's like another layer of awareness,
Yep.
consciousness, and then giving yourself the opportunity to process it on your own. Personally, I'm a really big fan. I always It's one of my favorite pictures to keep on my desk. It's me and my brother when we were little kids with our childhood dog. I always encourage keeping like a childhood photo around of you and talking to that little girl if the trauma was, when you were younger, and saying things to her like, you're doing this and I'm here to take care of you,
Mhm.
and this isn't happening to you again, and I'm here now, I'm here to be your voice, and really talking to that wounded part of yourself that starts to show up, and remind her that that the adult version of yourself, the adult Melissa, is the one who's having this conversation. It's not the little girl Melissa that's having this conversation. And if the little girl comes up, it's my role as the adult version to turn to her and say, sweetheart, you're safe here. I'm
Yeah.
here to take care of you. You don't have to show up in that way anymore. So it's really
Yeah.
about, I think, cultivating an awareness and a non-judgment of what comes up, and then working with it in the moment and soothing yourself so that you don't try to ignore it or shut it down or judge it,
Mhm.
or yell to be quiet or push it away. It's like we want to work with it actively.
Yes.
And I also say this as somebody who's like done a lot of therapy. So I think it's more challenging to do this kind of work on your own, right?
Mhm.
It's really important, especially if you've got complex trauma, or like a real acute trauma that was like major in your life, to have some support with you to be
Yes.
able to process it, because it's very, very difficult to heal it all on your own. And
Yes,
as
it is.
beings, we're meant to have connection. We're not, I don't believe that we're meant to do it on our own.
Oh,
It's sort of
no,
like
definitely not.
opposite. Yeah,
Community is key
it
in
is.
healing.
Yes.
Yeah, and there have been many times when I've had to do that same thing. Baby Emmy, you're okay. You're
Yeah.
safe. I'm protecting you. They're not going to hurt you again. You're okay. And that is so powerful. So, and again, too, speaking about approaching it with grace, especially giving yourself grace and allowing yourself to build your awareness, because parenting without trauma or without being highly sensitive is hard. It's, I don't think it was meant to be an easy journey. But when you add those other things on top, of course, it's going to elevate it. If you feel deeper, if you have got extra stuff to work through, of
Yes.
course.
Yes. And one of the things that I find in my work with sensitive families is that the very thing our sensitive kids are needing from us, which is
Mhm.
to teach them how to become aware of, identify, and express emotions appropriately, how to regulate our emotions when they get dysregulated. That's the very thing that we didn't learn how to do. And so now
Exactly.
kids are acting out in ways to push us to do the very thing that we didn't learn how to do. So part of why it's so hard is because it's forcing us to grow into an adult that we aren't yet. And not only
Hmm.
are we raising children, but we're raising ourselves at the same time. And so that's why it can feel so intense and overwhelming. Is it's hard enough to learn this for ourselves as adults without children.
Yeah,
When our kids are in our face, and maybe our relationship with our partner is challenging, or maybe our partner's also learning it, or they're dealing with their own healing from trauma, it adds all of these layers of complexity. And so that's why coming back to like self-compassion and non-judgment, and saying you're doing the best that you can, um, is it's really, really important. I'm an advocate of imperfect parenting,
yeah,
and lowering the bar, lowering it. There is no way to be perfect. There is no doing it right all the time. And when that's our goal, and it's an unattainable goal, then we feel badly about it. And then there's more shame,
absolutely.
more guilt, and it just becomes this like add-on spiral. So I am a real advocate of imperfect parenting, of doing it the best that you can, of being gentle with yourself and your children. And one more thing that's really, really, really beneficial for sensitive kids is when we as adults model for them our own emotional dysregulation, our own upset,
Hmm.
and saying things like, I'd really love to help you, and I have to take 2 minutes to
Hmm.
calm my body before I do that. I'm just going to sit here and take a few deep breaths. I'm going to get some cold water, and then I'm ready. There's don't push through your own
Yeah.
dysregulation to be present for your kids. I mean, granted, there are moments that are life and death, right? That are real crisis
Yeah.
moments. But on the whole, on the regular, when we show them that our emotional regulation is our first stop, it's the
Yes.
most important piece for us to be able to show up for them, then we are teaching them that number one, it's okay to not be regulated all the time. It's okay to
Hmm.
take time out for yourself. Prioritizing self-care matters. Here's how
Hmm.
we express our emotions and what we do with them when we're upset. There's so much rich learning in that. And I see so many parents who skip over that because they want to tend to their kids right away. And
Hmm.
I'm a huge advocate of tending to yourself, tend to that little girl or the part of you that's wounded or the part of you that's dysregulated, and then show up for your child.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's going to be so much harder to deal with them. And you're
Yeah.
missing all of the rich teaching that we
Hmm.
didn't get, which is why that's our pattern. So this is what
Yeah.
where we also break those generational patterns is in tending to ourselves before we move into to meeting our children where they are.
Absolutely. And, when you push through, as we were taught in the 80s and 90s, just get through it, like suck it up, buttercup, um, you tend to increase your trigger. And then you're backpedaling and needing to apologize to your kids, which isn't all bad because teaching your kids how to apologize, how to take responsibility for their mistakes is a necessary lesson as well. But it's so much richer to model giving yourself grace and allowing yourself to feel your feelings because then they're also seeing that, mommy's not scared of emotions. And my emotions are okay because mommy's not scared of hers. I don't have to be scared of mine. Like they pick up on so much.
And they copy what we do, and they learn
Absolutely.
how to do it from us. And so if our response to a trigger or an unwanted emotion is to push it away or hide from it or ignore it or just, you know, grit our teeth and move through it, that's what they learn. And that's why most of us are the way that we are, because that's what we
Yeah,
were raised with. And so it really is a lot of work to do this differently. It doesn't, it's not like, it just feels hard. It is. You're
it is hard.
changing generational patterns. You're rewiring your own brain. You're learning how to do things differently. So of course it's going to feel hard because it's all new. And
Yeah.
this is like the work that matters most in life. So it's not going to come easily, but it doesn't mean that you don't do it. And it doesn't mean that you don't take a break when you need it. And it doesn't mean that you don't be honest with your kids when you've had a day and you just don't have anything to give. I'm also a fan of like using the TV in the right way and saying like, I don't have anything. I can't hang out tonight. I can't play a game tonight. Let's sit and watch a movie.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just need something passive to be with your kids. You know, we want to be gentle with ourselves and do the best that we can legitimately, not by
Yeah.
like turning a blind eye to what's going on, but by really being present to it, by being honest with ourselves about where our capacity is, and then showing up in the best way that we can.
Absolutely. Um, I would like to, for a second, discuss temper tantrums as a highly sensitive parent for a highly sensitive child, because that highly sensitive child is going to be much quicker at reaching of going out of their window of tolerance and into that hyper arousal. And that's a lot for us as a highly sensitive parent to work with. So can we speak to that for a moment? Because I think there are more parents than are visible who are struggling with this.
So there are a couple of pieces to it, and my answer might be a little unsatisfying. A lot of times parents come up and they're like, what do I do when my kid has a tantrum?
Mm.
My response is like, breathe through it, it'll be over soon. It's the wrong question. It's sort of like saying, I've jumped out of an airplane without a parachute. What do I do? I'm not sure.
Right.
Don't jump out without the parachute. So, um, what I teach my family is how to prevent the tantrums from happening, and then what to do after they've happened so that it's an opportunity for connection and learning. But in the moment, you get through it. You just try to get through it. I want to say that it's not your responsibility or job or obligation to keep your child from having temper tantrums. They are going to happen from time to time. They're
Developmentally necessary
part of
to happen.
development. Yes, exactly. And some of us as adults still have them. Why? Because we go back to our trauma of not feeling heard and nobody understood us. So developmentally, they're appropriate. At some point, we should be growing out of them. And so, um, my suggestion is, if you've got 2, 3, 4 year olds, the best you can do is when it's happening, say to yourself, like, oh, they're having such a hard time. And like, I'm just going to give them a little bit of space while they work through it and they breathe and they shake it out of their body. And I'm going to be here when they need me. And you try not to take it on too personally. Again, don't like feel the guilt, like, oh, if I was a better mom, this wouldn't happen. That's nonsense. You can't prevent them all the time. However, we can prevent them sometimes. And the way that we prevent them is through having routines that are predictable for our kids, having consistent ways of doing things, asking them to do things through language that helps them feel empowered so they don't feel like they're being bossed around. This is really important for the strong-willed, sensitive kids. So there's a bunch that we can do on the front end to try to prevent them. And then again, when it happens, we do our best to stay calm and stay close. And I like to encourage parents to use language, especially with sensitive kids, that's kind of broad in general. It feels really bad to a sensitive kid when language is specific and it's inaccurate. So instead of saying to your kid, "You're really angry, I said it's time to leave the park," well, they might not be angry. Remember, they have all of these emotions. They might be
Mhm.
disappointed. They might be confused. They might be feeling other things rather than angry. So I encourage using broad statements like, "This looks really big for you. Something big is happening here. This looks intense. I'm thinking that this doesn't feel right. You wish it was a different answer."
Mhm.
Those kind of statements, so that we're not mislabeling what's happening for them, just kind of staying broad. And then on the back end, depending on their age, how developed their verbal skills are, talking with them and saying something like, "Ooh, that felt really big for you. I wonder what happened." I like to use language like, "I wonder, I'm curious, I'm
Yeah.
thinking." The curiosity is what we're after. Sometimes we use language with sensitive kids like, "Well, why?" Why can feel like an imposition or like a judgment. Like, "Why were you so upset when it was time to leave the park?" The kid's thinking, "Why was I upset? Because I was having fun and I'm a kid and I don't care that it's lunchtime." So rather than asking a why question, saying, "I'm wondering what happened when I said it was time to leave the park," or "I'm curious about what felt so bad. And do you know?" I also love to use like a visual cue with little ones, like emojis. There are all sorts of like emoji charts that you can use, or
Mhm.
we when Hunter was really little, we made little like popsicle sticks with emojis on them, and we would pull them out and use them to talk about how we were feeling, because sometimes it's hard to know what you're feeling, but if you see all of these options, it might feel a little easier. And sometimes there were 10 emotions going on at the same time.
Yeah.
Sensitive kids, it's like we paint in layers with our emotions as sensitive people. It's usually not just one thing. So looking at an emoji chart with them after and saying, "I wonder what you were feeling. This is how I was feeling. How were you feeling?" And talking with them about it. So the before, the setup, and
Mhm.
then the after, the processing, that teaches them to process this way, in a linear way, rather than get stuck in this spinning
Hamster
around and
wheel.
this ruminating. Um, Actually, tantrums can be a wonderful thing because they teach us where we need to have a little more structure and predictability on the front end. And then they give us the opportunity for emotional processing on the back end. So if you can shift your approach into those places and say, like, when it happens, I'm just going to kind of stay out of the way and be as loving and compassionate as I can. And then I'm going to swoop back in and help them on the other side. That's my sometimes unsatisfying suggestion for it, because I know people want a foolproof in the moment thing to stop it. Number one, if that existed, I'd write the $1 billion book on it. But number two, that's not how emotions and energy work. Once they're moving in that big way, they have to move out of our body. And so if you can shift your mindset to seeing a tantrum as an opportunity to clarify what we're doing to help our kids feel more predictability and consistency, and then help them process emotions, then the middle part doesn't feel so awful and so intense.
Yeah, absolutely. Depending upon where you are in your trauma recovery journey and where you're at with your self-awareness and your awareness of your triggers, a tantrum can be super triggering as a parent. And so what I would like to add here is becoming aware of your trigger so that you're not escalating your child's tantrum and causing more of a tussle than is
Yeah.
necessary, is key. It's super, super, super important
Yes.
because as parents, we've got our own emotions and our kids are going through things. And so it can be super triggering, and that's okay. Your triggers aren't the enemy, they are a communicator.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is when a trigger comes up and it feels so overwhelming that now we're sort of joining in the chaos with our
Hmm.
children, it's like we're letting them be the lead in the regulation.
Hmm.
It's like they're dysregulated and we're joining the dysregulation. And ultimately, the goal is that even when they're dysregulated, we are regulated and they can join us
Hmm.
in our regulation. We can be the leader of
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
regulation. And so if you find yourself being triggered and kind of pulled into it, saying to yourself, I'm not in my adult self right now. I'm
Hmm.
in my child self, which is why I'm letting my 3-year-old lead the
Hmm.
regulation here. You know, if I was in my adult self, I'd be able to kind of redirect us. But and again, it's the awareness. It's not that we have to change it in the moment. It's building those connections, building the awareness that this is what's happening for me in the moment, and that I'm out of my frontal lobe. I'm in my reactive brain. I'm out of my adult self. Just that can usually be enough to help us kind of like snap out of it a little bit, to get a little bit of distance from the
Yeah.
trigger.
Yeah. Wow. I could talk all afternoon. How can our listeners connect with you if they wish to do so?
Yeah, so my website is melissaschwartz.com. I'm on most social medias with the same handle. You can find me that way. But the website is the best place. I have all sorts of free downloads and courses and things like that. And so if anybody wants to learn more from me, that's the best place.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Melissa. It was a pleasure having you.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Emily. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Mamahood After Trauma. If today's episode resonated with you, make sure to grab your Unlocking Peace guide from the link in the show notes to start your healing journey with practical tools. Remember, Mama, you're not alone in this. Together, we're mending the past so mamas can mama in peace. See you next time.